Press the bell icon on the YouTube app to never miss a video from News Laundry.
On November 12th, the BBC launched its Beyond Fake News project, an international initiative to tackle fake news via TV, radio, and digital mediums, among others. The BBC kickstarted the project by releasing its research findings on why and how disinformation is shared. The report pertaining to India, Duty, Identity, Credibility, Fake News, and the Ordinary Citizen in India makes for a fascinating read. Among other things, it states that it is nationalism, as well as people's desire to project their identity, to contribute to what they think is national identity, is what is driving fake news. To discuss this report, BBC's Beyond Fake News initiative, and the larger phenomenon of fake news, we have with us Tarik Kafala, Controller of Languages at BBC World Service, and Shantanu Chakrabarti,
Hi.
Head of Audience Insight. So two guys who are running the show. Hello guys, welcome to NL Interviews. So before we jump to the bigger question of nationalism being the driver of fake news, what I want to ask is, how would you define fake news?
Okay, shall I start?
Please do.
Fake news is a composite of several things that we have other words for. So fake news has been around for a long time. It is a composite of disinformation, it's propaganda possibly, and stories that are made up for particular reasons, usually for the social media environment, which are, they can be for political reasons, they can be for commercial reasons, they can be for fun, they can be playful, but they are deliberately made up, they're confected, and they often have to have fake news to work well, has to have a grain of truth, something that somebody can relate to their real lived experience or something they know, and that gives it sort of fuel.
So the intent would be to mislead, is what would be
I
the
think
test of
that
fake
that's
news?
one of the definitions of
So
fake news.
how do we separate fake news from editorial oversight or misinformation?
Okay, so I would include misinformation because that has deliberate deliberation in it as part of fake news, the wider definition. I think editorial intent, newspapers, news organizations, even the BBC, make mistakes. And that is not fake news. When you make a mistake, the idea is that you should apologize for the mistake, you should admit to the mistake, you should correct the mistake. That's a different thing. Sure. I don't think we should include editorial mistakes or even editorial shortcomings as part of the definition of fake news.
So, if I might take a slightly different line, because I'm coming from the audience research.
Sorry for cutting you there. I also wanted to ask, how do we differentiate it from media bias?
So, look, one of the reasons why fake news starts to flourish, and which is, we outlined in the report, there need to be certain conditions, and one of them is a level of skepticism about the intents and motivations of the media, right? So, as academics, and lots of academics have tried to define it and said, hey, here are these 7 categories, starting right from satire to outright, propaganda. The problem is the ordinary person uses the term fake news to club all of this. So part of the solution has to be a much more rigorous approach for the entirety of the media to ensure that mistakes don't happen, especially in an environment that gets more politicized. You will have even the ordinary citizens saying that's fake because...
The things that they disagree with is
that they disagree with, right? That's part of it. The things that they immediately call out as fake, citizens, are the fantastical, right? Solar rays are going to explode my phone, right? That, or scams and scares. But one of the problems is exactly this, is that their audiences or citizens' definitions of fake news is ever expanding, and it doesn't help when legitimate media organizations, yes, there are mistakes, but when a legitimate media organization jumps the gun and does something that's egregiously wrong, which is beyond a mistake, it leads to that sense of, citizens saying, I can't differentiate between fake and fact.
You can't really trust the source.
That's the problem.
Thank you for bringing us to the report. So in the report, one of the things that you've said is that nationalism is driving fake news. Nationalism is based on people's feelings and sentiments. So to address fake news would be also to address the driver or the primary cause or motive. So how do we address or how do we check people's sentiments, people's emotions?
But that's entirely the point, right? You are not checking people's sentiments and emotions, and what we are doing in the report is describing the phenomenon.
So how do we address nationalism as a driver of fake news?
But that is a bigger question than what I can answer, right? How do we address nationalism?
I don't think it's for us to address nationalism.
Yes.
What we're identifying here, Shantanu, please correct me if I'm wrong, is a phenomenon whereby a sense of national pride, a sense of national belonging, a sense of national identity is one of the drivers. There are many, but it is one of the drivers for sharing content. It gives you that sense that I am contributing to the mission of the country, to its success, to the celebration of its success. The media, in many cases, seen as failing to do that. Citizens are taking it into their own hands. That's one of the drivers.
Sure.
Now, the content that is being shared may be, depending on your definitions, be described as fake news. But it is just one of the things that in this context, in the Indian context, is driving the behavior.
Sure.
We're not saying that by addressing fake news you're going to address nationalism. There's nothing
My question is actually the opposite.
Yeah.
So to address fake news,
Do you need to address nationalism?
because that is what is driving fake news, according
It's
to
one of the
things
factors,
that is
right?
Sure.
So yeah, sure. Look, one of the leaps we can make from the research, even though this was in India and there were parallel projects in Kenya and Nigeria, you don't quite see this kind of thing happening in Kenya and Nigeria because it seems that their respondents are in a slightly different stage where
The
they are
context
saying,
matters.
right, and what they're saying is in Kenya, for example, there's been a history of the country being divided around tribal lines. Right, and Nigeria, there's been a history of, some things around the north and the south, the Muslim part and the Christian part. You really get a sense of people saying, no, let's go past those divides and then we can do things better. So what you don't see in Nigeria and Kenya is these debates around what does it mean to be a nation, kind of contributing to fake news in quite that way, but your anxieties and aspirations, as much as in India, but your anxieties and aspirations, for example, if there's a huge unemployment crisis, spike in scams that are about getting you jobs, right? So in some ways, it's a distorted mirror of what the nation is talking about. I mean, this makes it sound more grandiose than it is, but that's what it is, right? What we're trying to do is to say, in a society, why has this thing emerged? So you have to address all of those things.
We know the report has put out this is one of the drivers. What I'm asking is, what's the next step?
Next step for me as a researcher is to do more research and to get other researchers to do more research.
Sure.
For us, from the editorial side, the next step is to understand the research and see if it helps us inform our editorial processes, what we're delivering to our audiences, and also how we understand those audiences. The behavior is what we're trying to understand.
So one of the approaches that the BBC report is employing to address fake news is through media literacy, right? So this is a two-part question. One, you already mentioned that this was done, the research was done in India and Kenya.
And Nigeria.
Nigeria. So why these three places? And the second is in a country where literacy levels are below 80%. And the overall internet penetration, rural and urban, is less than 40%. What are the challenges do you see in implementing these media literacy programs? And how would these be addressed? So the first part to you and the second part to you.
Well, actually, you're better placed to address both parts.
Sure. I'll address the first part of the question. Why India, Kenya and Nigeria? Primarily because these are very large markets. They're quite developed in terms of their media habits and in terms of connectivity, and they are large markets for us. So strategically, we have an interest in understanding the larger markets, the areas where we've invested.
So why not the US or Russia?
Okay, the US and Russia, they're markets in which there is a great deal of research, little
certainly
of it
in the US, and in the significant volume of the research on the
is in the US and habits. In Russia, I don't think Russia is not as large a market as India is for us in the current situation, but also this is something we wanted to discover in markets we're investing in a heavy way, and in India is an area we're investing.
And you know, from
investing in heavily.
Very clearly, right at the start of it, you know, our Jamie Angus, our director, was saying, let's make a contribution in rigorous empirical research in markets where there hasn't been. And at the end of the day, our day job is not to do this necessarily. So we are hoping it's going to be picked up in various places, in various forums, and other academics and think tank people are going to come to us and, you know, scrutinize it with the kind of depth, you know, you've done, because that leads to better understanding.
I like how this conversation is directly going towards the question that I hope for, which is the economics of fake news. But I do want to go back to the second question about the challenges that this program would face, media literacy program would face.
Okay, we operate on digitally, but also on radio and television in India and the other two markets we're talking about. So digital connectivity is not the only way we reach our audiences. We're also reaching out into schools. So some of the program involves us visiting schools, giving schools the tools, the information, the materials in order to do their own work around media literacy. So it's a much wider campaign than
just digital. Okay.
Can I, if you don't mind, can I add?
Absolutely.
So, let's not get into the trap of thinking that the problem will affect poorer people more or people who are less educated. This is a very deeply rigorous but qualitative exploratory study. And the main point of this is that if the circumstances are right, and every now and then the circumstances will be right for each one of us, every one of us is susceptible. Because what those fake news messages are doing, it's short-circuiting our, you know, rational thinking and going straight to the gut, right? And all of us have biases. So part of it, yeah, of course, media literacy, but I'm saying it's not just media literacy. It's about, you know, critical thinking and pausing to think before sharing, inculcated as a habit.
True.
Is the very important thing for all of us.
So one of the things the report pointed out was that many people share without consuming the content. So they're not performing even the most cursory check of
because they're depending on the sender and not the source.
Indeed, and you know that's a really important behaviour to sort of acknowledge in this.
So as I said, I want to go to the economics of fake news. Fake news itself makes more money. Busting fake news might not be as feasible. There are organizations that are doing it, but they are in far between. They're less in numbers. So what I'm trying to ask is, what are your thoughts on busting fake news as an alternative business model? Because we need more people if we are trying to make critical thinking as an habit that every individual inculcates to sort of bust or move beyond this fake news problem. Then how do we do this? Because not everyone would have the same amount of resources as the BBC.
Certainly.
And fake news, busting fake news is not the most economically feasible model.
No. We're not a commercial organisation, so we make decisions about where we put our resources and effort on a strategic, depending on our editorial values and our agreements, our licenses, our objectives. So we don't face this dilemma. More widely, the news market has been under extraordinary economic pressure for many years. The digital revolution is part of this, but it's been before that. The flight of advertising from traditional media is obviously a big problem. High quality journalism has always cost a huge amount of money.
It has.
And you know, I don't think the situation now is currently very different from previously. I mean, before we had the digital revolution and the changes in people's habits in consuming news, it was always the case that news that drew advertising, and that tended to be sports, comics, celebrity news, you know, not the high-end news, not the news that you need to make serious decisions about your life, but the news that you liked around you and was part of your consumption habits. That was the news that drew. The high-end news, the difficult stuff where we might place myth-busting and fact-checking was always very economically challenging to make.
So how do we go beyond this? Yes.
We're not the ideal people to answer that question. I mean, we are, you know, there are many organizations. I mean, we had a guest yesterday on one of our panels from the Reuters Institute who try and support media literacy, they support fact-checking, they raise money in order to do this in various parts of the world. The BBC does this, of course. There will be organizations, there are ways to fund this difficult, non-commercially viable journalism. It always has been the case.
So it's difficult, but it's possible.
We hope so.
It has to be possible, otherwise we might as well all give up and go home.
Let's hope. So I want to move to the next question, which is the word fake news itself came into the media limelight when Hillary Clinton used it in December of 2016. And then it was sort of brought into the mainstream media, for the lack of a better word, by free use or overuse by the US President Donald Trump in January 2017. So the question I'm asking is, what is the role that political leaders, including the political leadership in India, are playing in contributing to the spread of fake news? Tarik, and then I would love for Shantanu to weigh in.
I think you should answer the
Indian example. Pass the tough one to me.
So, political leaders and their role in spreading fake news. I mean, individual political leaders, it's very difficult to say. I mean, if an official or a leader stands up and declares everything that they dislike or everything they disagree with is fake news, as Donald Trump has done on a few occasions, he's not using a definition of fake news that we understand. He's talking about things that are critical of him.
Yeah, critical of him, that he disagrees with.
That he disagrees with, that he dislikes in some way. Politicians do this in all places at all times. Things that they are critical of, they will criticize or try to suppress or more. So this is part of the media's strength and responsibility. And the difficulty that they face in certain situations. The role in spreading fake news, political campaigns have depended on always propaganda, partial telling of a story, putting messages out there that specifically serve the interests of a particular candidate or proposal or policy platform. So that in the fake news environment, in the environment of social media, this is just happening at a higher rate, a higher frequency, in a more targeted way, in a much more sophisticated way. It's the same thing, it's the same techniques, they're just applied in a very in a world where we know a lot about each other because we spend so much time on
Shantanu,
WhatsApp and Facebook.
Do you want to come in on this?
So, tracing from a dry, boring research point of view, tracing the linkages of that this thing or this word or this object came from that politician and then entered is a really difficult task, right? Okay. Do we know that your political parties of all colors, if given the chance, would be, do you really think any political party is holier than any other? I don't think so. I don't know deeply enough about the politics. So surely it does happen. What's new and interesting is the form. So when it's news and it's words and it's in there and it's a shading of the truth, but you're still using words, it seems to me slightly different from when you're using images and memes, which in some ways are able to short-circuit rational thinking. But at the end of this project, I think and I'm going to sound very woolly here, end of the project, the thing that we see is that even the fake news consumption of it is along political lines. It's not as if by using these images or memes or whoever, ordinary people are convincing people who are not of their points of view.
But what I'm trying to say is political leaders, because by the nature of their stature, are able to convince people even with fake news. If it's a leader saying...
again, because my job is to spend time with people, I'm not saying journalists don't, I don't buy these arguments easily that a politician says something and someone immediately believes and changes. It's not that simplistic.
So before we close this interview, I've been told that we are running out of time. I have just two very quick questions. One is, as you mentioned, that media sort of is being targeted, please correct me if I'm wrong, or rather politicians or political leaders who disagree with media sort of term anything they disagree with as fake news. So would you say... Some of them, absolutely. Some of them. So would you say fake news, you also Shantanu, is being used as a tool to curtail media freedom?
I think fake news muddies the water. Fake news feeds off a certain environment of skepticism in the media or mistrust of the media. I think that the research lists some conditions where fake news, for fake news to prosper, to exist. I think they're connected, but there's no direct causal link. I don't think fake news is part of a wider phenomenon. It's a societal thing. The media is part of that mix.
Sure. Okay. So, Shantanu, for you, one clear message that is coming out of your report is do not share or publish information that is not verified. So the question is, in today's breaking news cycle, is that possible? I mean, we are based on TRPs. The media is running on clicks. So is that possible?
Well, the report isn't telling people do not share things that are not verified, right? We are not prescriptive.
Okay.
We are saying we are telling everyone who's interested in that, if you have to understand it, understand why people are sharing unverified things, right?
Okay.
That's what, sorry, I'm just being, true to the research.
Sure.
Is it hard? Of course it's hard, because you're going against the grain of human nature, which is to make things easier for themselves. You are going against the grain of, the highly sophisticated mechanisms of the platforms, which are built to share, right? And they're doing a brilliant job at what they're built to do.
But here the trade-off is the business of news.
Sure, it could be, right? But hard questions are interesting because they are, they're difficult to challenge. So at the end, you come back to it. We've seen enough in the research, right? The conversation about the research has been about a tiny part of it. But in the research, we've seen enough, including the ability of people to lead their lives despite all of these pressures, to give us enough clues to say we have some directions towards the solution. The societal and the socio-economic things, like nationalism or the business models of organizations, the research can't address, but there's enough in there to say with concerted action, you can start to tackle it.
Okay.
It's not doom and gloom.
My absolute last question to the two of you is, one thing that stood out to me in the report was mentioned right at the beginning. Google and Twitter are co-sponsors of this independent research. So the question is, can a project be truly independent if it is sponsored by Twitter in this case, which is one of the platforms that the research was investigating? Yeah, well, I can start with it and then you can, well, first there's the editorial values of the BBC. They were very clear, Google and Twitter, that they are participating because, they want to be a part of the discussion and help in the discussion. And very clearly at the start, they said, we don't want any editorial involvement, which means in the design of it, in the analysis of it, in the reporting of it, there is no contribution from Google and Twitter, other than the fact that they've paid the money. The more important thing is, well, I work for the BBC, and the BBC as an organization has very good means to ensure that these kinds of things don't happen. And as a researcher, the credibility of the research cannot be compromised. And for that matter, you'll ask Tareq, because he's one of my stakeholders. Even what Tareq says will not influence the research that I or my team do, leave alone Google and Twitter.
Frankly, the research is worthless unless it is done, the methodology is solid, the gathering, the process. The research, we're using this research because it helps us do a better job. And if the research is compromised,
there's very little that
we're wasting our time.
It's the same thing.
It's quite, it's very simple in that way.
Any journalistic procedure will have problems and flaws, but if done with rigor, you'll do the best you can despite the limitations.
Thank you so much, guys, for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you.